Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 2017 and we're going to be taking a look at Alice Cooper and he's going to be performing School's Out. So let's get Alice and the band up on screen and see how he gets on. I'm just going to jump in here just before the extended guitar solo that's about to come in, which is always welcome, especially live and with a great band. And we've got Nita Strauss here on lead guitar, and the whole band are so solid throughout this performance. But this song just is a masterpiece in so many different ways. The way the song starts with that guitar riff, it is such a solid riff and something that's instantly recognizable and something that you can repeat over and over again and it doesn't get boring, and that's always the markings of a fantastic riff. Just something that melodically just somehow sits in there in your psyche and you'll be humming it when you're walking around. But then also the contradiction that we've got here with the nursery school rhyme almost sound to that second section. And again, the melody here throughout the whole song in terms of the vocals are so repeatable, and that's why a massive crowd like this can sing along and get into it, because we're not going through any vocal gymnastics. And that was what Alice Cooper was all about, just singing a simple melody but a fantastic melody over a great band. In this track, the original track, we've got little hooks going on all the time with lead guitar, so there is so much in this track. Even though it's a simple setup, simple progression, The main thing that this track has got going for it is the connection with an emotion amongst the people listening to it. Because generally, I think it's safe to say most people didn't like school and don't like school. So it means all of those people listening to it can attribute this song to an emotion that they went through when they were at school, or even kids that were at school when this was released. It doesn't matter where you live, what country you're from, because the message is the same, and everyone experiences that and looks at the clock waiting for the summer holidays to start, and going even further in this song, suggesting that school has blown up and you never ever have to go back. It's such an attractive thought, especially for those who are in their teenage years. And the major section that we change into has been referred to as a childhood rhyme, but it's not something that I've heard here in the UK. But then again, I'm not really up to scratch with my nursery rhymes at the age that I am. But having that contradiction in terms of the attitude at the beginning of the song, listening to that riff so minor based, and then that total switch over to that simplistic melody over now a major progression, something that's sounding happy. It just works so well in the song. Alice Cooper, I'm sure himself, would admit that he's not a classically trained singer. That's not what you're going to get from an Alice Cooper show live. But let's not underestimate the importance that is placed on melody and harmonies live, because this is a great example. When you're listening to this nursery rhyme section, we've got at least 2 or 3 harmony lines going on, being sung by the band in the background. So there is so much melodic content thrown in here. Like I said, we've got a lot of lead hooks going on the whole time. So it's such an interesting journey. Even though it's a simplistic journey progressively, there's so much going on musically and melodically to keep you interested. A huge part of what Alice Cooper does, and I say does because he's still on tour now. In fact, I think he's in the UK next week, and he has been touring his whole life and working so hard at it. But what you get is a great live show and something that is out there to be different, and especially early on to shock. And he has been referred to as the father of shock rock and the grandfather of shock rock more recently. But having that totally different approach back in the late 60s, we're talking 1968 when Alice first started, and thinking about the music at the time and some of the videos that I have analysed from the late 60s on this channel, it really does give you an idea as to how out there Alice Cooper was when he started, some of the things that he did, and the amount of press and publicity that he got because of the shows and the things that he did, and some of those stories that came out from his shows that weren't necessarily true, but Alice was very clever at not denying them, but not confirming them. So, of course, that just ran riot. But it's the whole package with Alice. I always say on this channel about the bands and the artists that have been around for many years and have had prolonged success all have 3 things. The first thing is putting on a show, being entertaining, and Alice probably gets 11 out of 10 on that aspect. We've also got great songs. You need to have that. Alice, this is a great example. Just great melody, being able to connect with an audience en masse, and that is the point of a song, and that's what makes a good song. And then finally, technical ability. Alice has always been in front of a great band. He's not one of these guys that's going to suffer fools gladly. He's going to get a top band, and we've got top lead players here, top rhythm players, but also players who can sing backing vocals, backing harmonies. It's so important for the melody that is held within these tracks. Even though there's so much show going on, you might sometimes let that fly under the radar because visually there's so much to take in with an Alice Cooper show. Even to the point with this video, when we've got guitar solos going on, we're fixated on Alice, and the cameraman is fixated on Alice because of the show that's going on and the way that he orchestrates the crowd. Going back to where it all started for Alice, When he was young, he had this drive, especially at school. He wanted to appear in a talent show that they were hosting, and he got a few friends together and they did a parody of the Beatles. They changed a few lyrics of the songs, and his friend Glenn Buxton played guitar, and his other friends just mimed because Glenn was the only one that actually played an instrument. And they ended up winning that talent contest. In fact, in his high school yearbook, he said that he wanted to be a million record seller, and that's not the kind of thing that you write unless you mean it. And he was in bands after school, had various members in those bands, but was always with his friend Glenn. And in 1968, their band was called Nas, and they realized that Todd Rundgren also had a band of the same name. So they decided to change the name to Alice Cooper just because it was so randomly different to the music in terms of the exact opposite to what you should be calling the band. And it certainly worked out well because that direct contradiction between the name and the music would help them stand out. By the way, back in 1968, Alice was still Vincent. He didn't change his name until 1975, and he has said himself that that was the most important and successful move that he ever made. And on this channel, so many bands that have struggled with band names and registered trademarks, and some band members owning that trademark so other bands can't gig with the band name. It really was a smart move to change his name to Alice Cooper because it meant that now he could go on stage and call himself Alice Cooper, and there was nothing that could be done because that was now his name. Straight off the bat, Alice wanted to be different, wanted to stand out, and just wanted to shock people. And especially in the late 60s, a guy with mascara on stage, almost having that horror movie look, certainly would have shocked people. And so much so, at one of their early gigs, they emptied the venue in 10 minutes. So it wasn't successful from that point of view, but it was important because Shep Gordon was watching this gig, and he decided that he could take this band, and if he pointed them in the right direction, they had something. And he organized an audition with Frank Zappa, who at the time had his own record label and was looking for weird and wonderful acts, and this band certainly fit that bill. So Frank Zappa said to them, "Meet me at 7 at my house and you can have an audition for the label." So they took that as 7 a.m, but of course Frank meant 7 p.m. So anyway, they were knocking on his door at 7 a.m, they got him out of bed, he didn't know what was going on, but they set up and they performed this crazy music that they were playing, just everything full out. And Frank was really impressed, not only with the image, the delivery, but also that a band got up at 7 a.m. to wake him up to audition. So in 1969, they released Pretties for You, and they had a show in Toronto, and this went down as the chicken incident because something happened where they had a live chicken that's going to be part of the stage show, and I think it got into a pillow that Alice was going to rip open and have feathers going everywhere. So anyway, it got into that, and Alice threw the chicken into the crowd thinking that it was going to fly off, but he didn't know that they couldn't fly. So it landed in the front row where the wheelchairs were, and apparently it was ripped apart, but I don't know about this story whether they would do that in the crowd. But anyway, the details of that then got bled into the media, and obviously some facts got a little bit confused, and Frank Zappa rang up Alice and said, "Is it true that at the show last night you killed a chicken, ripped its head off or bit its head off and then drank its blood?" And Alice said, "Well, no, that didn't happen." But Frank said, "Well, whatever you do, don't deny that it happened. Just let everybody just put these stories out there." And that was a big part of Alice Cooper and the publicity, the live shows and the word of mouth, and sometimes, like I said at the beginning of this video, stories that weren't necessarily true, but they were myth, but then again, people might have believed them at the time. So unfortunately, the first two albums didn't go down so well, and they only had a 3-album deal, so it meant that this last one had to be successful, otherwise they were in trouble. So anyway, the late 60s, and in 1970, this is where they got Bob Ezrin involved in the production side of things. But also there was a change happening, and the change was Alice Cooper, because there was a lot of hippie bands and hippie crowds that were around at the time, and it was all about love and happiness. But then Alice Cooper came along, which was exactly the opposite. People hadn't seen anything like this before, and it really started to take off. So the final album, the third make or break album, was called Love It to Death, and it just so happened that this went down really well, especially I'm 18, the single, because that got to number 21 in the charts, so that was a massive hit. Another thing that happened is that Warner Brothers then took over that record deal and signed Alice Cooper and re-released that album, but now they had the backing of a bit more money and a lot more publicity, so that turned into their breakthrough album. With their live shows, they really made a conscious effort to be as shocking as possible and include anything that they could do in that live show to make the show stand out. And back in the early 70s, again, I don't think we can really appreciate how shocking these things were. It got to the point where countries, and even here in the UK, there were discussions about even letting Alice Cooper play because of the things that were included in his live shows. But of course, all of this is extra publicity. It's like that old saying, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Alice Cooper were a prime example of that. So they were doing these shocking shows in 1970 and onwards. In 1972 is when they released the album Schools Out with the accompanying single of the same name, and the single got to number 7 in the USA. It got to number 1 here in the UK. So like I mentioned earlier, they had that universal appeal. The album sold over 1 million copies and got to number 2 in the US charts. At this time, the shows were selling out like crazy because of the publicity surrounding them, and in 1974, after playing a lot and just living in each other's pockets, they decided to take a break as a band, and in 1975 is when Alice decided to release his own album called Welcome to My Nightmare, and that went really well. He was actually backed by Lou Reed's band for that album, and he also released a TV special that was called The Nightmare, and that was nominated for a Grammy, so that went down really well as well. And due to the success of The Nightmare, but also his solo album, it meant that Alice decided to go solo from then on. In the late 70s, Alice was struggling with alcoholism, and in 1978, he appeared on The Muppet Show. So he was getting himself on TV and still getting a hell of a lot of publicity for his music, and that show in itself is probably one of the last shows that you'd expect him to appear on. Just the way that he is, he just seems like a really cool guy to get to know, and by the way, great friends with Glenn Campbell back in the day, and check out the Glenn Campbell videos if you get a chance. Fantastic guitar player, lead player, country singer, you name it. But that crossover that Alice had was so unique and something just personal to him. During the early 80s, this is the time that Alice is referred to as his blackout period because of the effect of illicit substances that he was doing at the time. And during this time, he did pay for renovations for the Hollywood sign. He bought the O of the Hollywood sign for one of his friends, Groucho Marx, in memory of him. So that O, I'm not sure which one it is, but that was bought by Alice Cooper in order to get that sign refurbished and to get it standing for as long as possible. So during the 80s, he was still putting on epic shows and putting a lot of shock factor into those shows. And so much so that in Germany, they did edit the show so that it wasn't quite as gory as it was going to be initially, and during that time was when an MP from the UK tried to ban Alice Cooper from coming and playing here, and that show was The Nightmare Returns. So it was getting great reviews, everybody was loving it, but I think some people didn't really understand that it's just a show. In 1988, this is when Kip Winger played bass on a couple of albums, and if you want to check out Kip, he's on the channel somewhere as well. But this was the same year that Alice almost died during a rehearsal accident where he was pretending to hang himself. That was part of the show, but unfortunately the safety rope broke, so he literally almost did hang himself in a rehearsal, but fortunately he survived. But it was a really serious accident. But once he'd recovered the next year in 1989, that's when he released his album called Trash, and that also was a massive hit. It spawned the single Poison, which everybody will know, another massive hit in its own right as a single, and that got to number 2 in the UK, and it got to number 7 in the USA. So following this success, Alice got out there and played shows again. He did an arena tour, and in the 90s he released 2 more albums and also did collaborations with other artists. In 2003 is when he released his album called The Eyes of Alice Cooper, and that was critically acclaimed. That went down really well. He also received his star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2003, but I think that if you've bought the O in the Hollywood sign just to keep that Hollywood sign there, then you probably deserve to have a star on the Walk of Fame. In 2010, the original band were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and in 2014, he opened up for what was billed as the final tour for Motley Crue. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, he's still touring on a world tour as we speak. He's going to be here in under a week in the UK, so he's going to be playing in the USA as well. He's one of these guys that has an obvious drive to play live, put on shows, and has done for his whole career. And a lot of people sometimes think that musicians and particular artists might have an easy life, but Alice Cooper is one of those that has such a solid work ethic for playing to all the audiences that want to see him. He will always put himself out there, but you've got to really take your hat off to him as an artist, and to have that endurance in order to play for so many years consistently and always put on such a great show. But thank you so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!